Okay. Good morning, everybody. So today I am going to talk about 5 things I have learned from studying the life and music of Bach. I've wanted to give a presentation about Bach for a long time because he's a very important composer to me for many reasons. As a performer, I have often received very high praise, specifically for my performances of music by Bach. As a young pianist during my undergraduate degree, I remember playing Bach's 4th Partita in D major for Vladimir Feltzman at his piano festival in New York. My teacher, Robert Hamilton, told me he had heard from Feltzman that he was all right with my Bach playing, which was about the highest praise that one could get from Feltzman. I also remember several years later at the Virginia Waring competition, I played Bach's 5th Partita in G major in the semifinal round, and afterwards an audience member told me that my performance was deadly. I was a little bit surprised, but I believe that he meant it as a compliment. Bach is an important composer for essentially all musicians. If you're a pianist, you have to know about the well-tempered clavier, the French and English suites, the partitas, the inventions, and the Goldberg variations. If you're an organist, you have the Klavierübung, Book 3, and the concertos, and the sonatas, and the Orgelbuchlein. String players have the suites and partitas. Wind players have the concertos, and there's the flute sonatas. Singers have the passions and the cantatas. Everyone that doesn't have a solo work can still probably find a place somewhere in the Brandenburg concertos, the orchestral suites, or the Mass in B minor. And of course, performers on historical instruments have plenty to work on in Bach, whether it be viola da gamba, oboe da caccia, or harpsichord. Everyone has something to take from Bach. In addition to composing, he was also a teacher. He left us with works that were used in teaching his own children and used for the recreation of his wife and family. Who can imagine teaching any instrument without the minuets from the Notebook for Anna Magdalena Bach? Bach also straddled the worlds of both sacred and secular music. He left something for the musician who works in the church, as well as the musician who works outside of the liturgical context. His output of sacred music was quite extraordinary, composing essentially 5 complete yearly cycles of cantatas just in the first several years that he lived at Leipzig, plus special works like St. Matthew's Passion and the Mass in B minor. At the same time, he pioneered the secular concert format at Zimmermann's Coffee House, performing harpsichord concertos and other works purely for the enjoyment of the coffee-drinking public. He was also familiar with the world of the aristocracy and the world of the middle-class listener. During his employment at Curtin, he was the music director of all performances at court and served only one master, Prince Leopold. Yet, when he worked at Leipzig, his concerts in the coffee house were not run by aristocratic patrons, but rather were for the benefit of the general public and were supported by the purchases of coffee. Yet the music he composed and wrote for this larger audience was by no means dumbed down. Bach was also in no way above the human conflicts that inevitably occur between conductors and performers. Early in his career, he was particularly displeased with the playing of a certain bassoonist in a rehearsal, and he said something not very nice to him in front of everybody. This bassoonist later gathered up friends, waited for Bach in the street, and jumped out at him to attack him as recompense for this insult. My favorite part of this story is that Bach then took out his sword, which he obviously had with him, and defended himself admirably, poking the fellow in the shirt several times.
Where did you find that?
Yeah, it's in several biographies. Unfortunately, when the case was brought before the courts, the attacking bassoonist was acquitted. Bach left the city to find his fortunes elsewhere not too long after this incident. Johann Sebastian Bach was both a product of his time and also a man ahead of his time. He came from an intergenerational musical dynasty started by a certain Veit Bach, who fled religious persecution in Hungary in the mid-1500s. This massive extended family grew to encompass an interconnected network of Lutheran musicians across Thuringia by the time Bach was born in 1685. Johann Sebastian was trained by his family in something the family already did extremely well, and he excelled in it from an early age. Unfortunately, his parents both died when he was young, and he was cared for by his older brother, Johann Christoph Bach, from age 10 to 15. Christoph taught him the organ, kept him in his home, and introduced him to music from Christoph's own teacher, Johann Pachelbel. There's a story that Johann Sebastian used to sneak out in the middle of the night in order to copy the most difficult organ works from his older brother's collection. One evening, he was caught, and Johann Christoph confiscated the copy and never returned it. This makes Johann Christoph look like a grumpy figure, but we should remember that he no doubt knew he had quite the genius on his hands, and he was doing his best to keep him within line for his own safety. We know that Johann Christoph did allow his young ward to copy out many works during daylight hours. We also know that he introduced Johann Sebastian to the works of significant composers in his own family tree, like their uncle, who confusingly is also named Johann Christoph Bach. Johann Sebastian's brother also took the effort to compile a collection of important organ works for him, now called the Mörler manuscript, and he included many of Johann Sebastian's own early compositions in this collection. So, Johann Christoph was not just a scold, but taught his younger brother well and preserved the early compositions of the budding genius. It is difficult to escape the conclusion that family was incredibly important for the Bachs. Where would Johann Sebastian have ended up if he did not have someone in his family who was also knowledgeable in music and could teach him what he needed to learn to make his way in the world as a musician? As it turns out, he would himself return the favor to his older brother. After Christoph died, his son, Johann Heinrich, went to live with his uncle Sebastian in order to receive apprenticeship in becoming a professional musician. Johann Sebastian brought him into his professional routine and immediately set him to work copying out parts that were going to be needed in the performance of the Sunday's cantata. Johann Sebastian even let go of one of his two professional scribes so that Johann Heinrich could fill his role. Though, somewhat humorously, we do know that Heinrich was too slow at copying, so Wilhelm Friedemann or Johann Sebastian himself would usually have to finish his work. The amount of music copying that had to be done in order to make Bach's musical performances work was truly staggering. And not only were the two professional scribes constantly employed, but Bach's own family members were frequently recruited to help finish copies in time for the Saturday rehearsal. These family members included, of course, his wife, Anna Magdalena Bach. This brings me to the first thing I've learned studying the life and music of Bach. We are all in this together, and it takes our family and a network of friends to make our life in music happen. Bach was about as far from a lone genius as he could be, even though he was, of course, the most gifted member of the network he was embedded in. He did work harder than everyone around him, but his contribution couldn't have happened without his family, his network, his scribes, his students, his performing musicians, and his patrons. There is a reason that Bach never moved out of his homeland. Unlike Handel or Telemann, he instinctively knew that he needed his family network in order to make his best contribution as an artist, and so he never traveled out of Germany. How did Bach think about his artistic contribution anyway? This is an area where we bring assumptions as 21st century musicians that Bach perhaps would not have shared. For example, we assume that what a composer does is compose musical works. These works are supposed to be finished masterpieces that stand the test of time. But I would suggest that Bach's goal was always the continual refinement of music and its performance, and not necessarily finished musical works which could not be changed or repurposed. Throughout his life, Bach showed a recurring interest in rewriting, repurposing, reorchestrating, and reorganizing his compositional output. The Mass in B minor, for example, is almost entirely made up of music which was taken from other contexts across a time period all the way from 1714 to 1749. For example, the Crucifixus movement of the Credo is an adaptation of Cantata 12, written all the way back in 1714. And you can actually see that on the back of this sheet. On the left, you have the cantata from his Weimar years, and then the Mass in B minor, which he put together at the end of his life. He's basically just adapting the musical material from that cantata and giving it new words, changing the melody somewhat. He's refining it, but it's not new. It's also moved down a half step from F minor to E minor. The Hosanna movement is, so the Hosanna movement from the Mass in B minor is also probably taken from a secular cantata dedicated to the Elector of Saxony in 1734. So, in contemporary terms, it seems odd to us that a composer would spend so much time pillaging their previous output and reworking it into a kind of super collection. Sometimes these works aren't even kept within clean boundaries of sacred versus secular, but each type of music can easily transform into the other. Bach's supposed magnum opus, the Mass in B minor, actually has very little that is new in it. The first thing we need to understand is that Bach always had to compose for the situation. This meant that if something came up that needed music, he would either need to write something new, or borrow from himself, or perform music by another composer, or steal from another composer. By and large, for at least the first 2/3 of his life, he pretty much always wrote new music for the various situations he had to write for. The task of writing 5 complete cycles of cantatas in Leipzig, for example, went far beyond what his employers were asking for when they hired him. It would have been considered completely normal if Bach had just reused a lot of material for each week's cantata. Instead, it was entirely by his own initiative that he set himself the task of writing new music each week until 5 years' worth of cantatas were written basically from scratch. This actually used to not even be understood because the timeline of Bach's cantata output was thought to last from the beginning of his time in Leipzig in 1723 all the way to his death in 1750, but we now know that pretty much all of the cantatas were written in the first 6 or 7 years that he lived there. So all of that output is front-loaded, which makes it even more astonishing. So why would a composer with the ability to do something like that need to gather various pieces together in order to make a Mass in B minor at the end of his life? I think the answer is that Bach saw all of his compositional output, indeed all music, as something in process and not set in stone. No musical idea for Bach was ever completely exhausted. It could always be reworked and explored to a higher degree of perfection. If a work were written for a very specific circumstance that would never be repeated, then it was worthwhile to transplant it into a new context where it could be reused multiple times. And during that transplantation process, Bach couldn't help himself. He had to refine the material and make it better the second time around. The same thing is true of his transcriptions of works by other composers and his transcriptions even of his own pieces. His transcriptions of violin concertos by Vivaldi are not merely literal translations, but they're more like further research into the musical ideas present in the original. Bach could never leave well enough alone. He always had to explore what was possible. If you look at the front of the handout, the first one is a Vivaldi violin concerto example, and then Bach's transcription of it for harpsichord. You can see that the original, at least what's written down, is pretty bare. Okay. So when Bach transcribes it, he turns it into this.
That was better.
Yeah. So as his life continued, Bach came to value the refining process even more than the process of what we would consider to be original composition. He wanted the very best of what he had discovered in his lifetime to be compiled into its best possible version and developed to its highest potential. This is the second thing I've learned from studying the life and music of Bach. The pursuit of excellence in art is a choice. Our discoveries are never finished, and we can always learn and improve our work more. Bach didn't have to do the work that he did with excellence. He chose to. This brings us to the question of style. What is Bach's style? What does it mean to play Bach with a sensitivity towards his style? As I have thought about this, I think we need to bear in mind the Catholicity of his musical outlook. Sometimes we hear it said that Bach is pure music, like distilled water that has no minerals in it and tastes kind of funny. I don't think this is right. Rather, I think Bach was capable of absorbing styles and integrating them into his outlook. He liked to let them sit juxtaposed with each other without letting them simply be blended. For example, we know that one of his teachers, Georg Bohm, was a continuo player for the opera. So even though Bach didn't write any operas, that doesn't mean he wasn't influenced by Baroque opera. It should also be remembered that as a boy, Johann Sebastian was in a church choir, and he even received room and board as a musically gifted orphan. In this choir, he was expected not only to sing from the Eisenach hymnal, but also to sing polyphonic works at sight by composers like Josquin des Prez and Henricus Isaac. We also know that he was very influenced by the concertos of Vivaldi, and that the Italian concerto style influenced all of the music that Bach wrote in all genres. So I would suggest that when we look at the Well-Tempered Clavier, we should see not just one Bach style, but rather a spread of instrumentations, genres, and contexts. For example, the E major prelude and fugue from Book 2 of the Well-Tempered Clavier features the most incredible juxtaposition of genres. The prelude is a lively trio sonata, allegro movement. But the fugue is an antique a cappella four-voice motet from the era of Palestrina. So this is the second example. So the prelude is clearly Baroque in time period and trio sonata format, continuo on the bottom, and then two solo instruments on top. Okay, and then he pairs that with something that's clearly Renaissance polyphony in the sense that Bach delighted in this kind of stylistic heterogeneity. And he wanted his music to represent the possibility of musical synthesis on the keyboard. Or consider the G major prelude and fugue from Book 2. The prelude is a vigorous harpsichord showpiece. The fugue, by contrast, has a subject inspired by the long-winded themes characteristic of organ music. So here's our prelude. And then the fugue, it's got this long organ subject. The question of whether this particular prelude and fugue is meant to be played on the harpsichord or organ is, in my mind, beside the point. Bach understood the characteristics of different genres, but he sought to shift them around and combine them in unexpected ways. I think he was delighted by the idea of playing an organ fugue on the harpsichord. Our imagines have to be looking for the right genre of piece in order to grasp the style, and we will do a better job of that if we are familiar with a broad range of music by Bach and not simply his keyboard music. We can learn, like Bach did, something from each composer, and with greater boldness, we can even try to, when we experiment with music, we're probably not going to come up with anything as amazing as Bach did, but there's something about his attitude of being willing to tamper with things. So here's my third principle. All music is music. And we can learn something important from any kind of music. I don't know what Bach would have made of the music of our day, but I do know that he was a passionate student of every style of music that he could get his hands on. And he copied out countless scores by hand so that he could understand their style and incorporate his discoveries into his own work. Perhaps even a genius of Bach's stature would have been perplexed by the range of musical styles which now exist in the 21st century. Or perhaps he would have been able to cut through the divisions that we can't see past in order to grasp the inner unity and then to build upon it. Let's talk more about the music. When I was in school, somehow the idea occurred to me that I needed to work on my sight reading, once and for all. What came into my mind was the following idea. Maybe if I play through all the keyboard music of Bach that I can find, then I will become a fluent sight reader of any music. So that is what I did. Each day I would spend an hour or two slowly chugging through the well-tempered clavier and then the partitas, inventions, sinfonias, etc. Then I got the chorales and played through those. Eventually I ran out of Bach that I could find for keyboard, and I had to start reading other composers. At which point I realized that while Bach certainly prepared me to a certain extent for that, it was by no means a comprehensive preparation for sight reading music by Brahms or Hindemith or Prokofiev. Yet what I learned from doing that was that there is so much Bach which is truly beautiful. The Sarabande from the G major French suite, for example, or the Passepied from the G major partita, or the G minor, the last G minor variation from the Goldberg variations. It's almost too painful to listen to. And then there's all of the non-keyboard music. Near the end of the St. Matthew's Passion, there's an aria for bass, Mache dich mein Herz so rein. It brings me to tears almost every time I hear it. Or there's the Chaconne for solo violin from the D minor partita. Or the B minor orchestral suite with the unbelievable flute solo at the end. A more recent discovery for me is the second verse of Cantata number 4, Christ lag in Todesbanden, which is a duet for soprano and alto with continuo. And it's about death. What could be more exquisite and yet sobering than this haunting movement? There's no doubt that Bach left us with an excessive amount of profound music, which would give us enough to do for a whole lifetime. Yet, if we are honest, we know that many students do not care for Bach and regard him as a kind of burden that every music student must bear. The truth is something you all as music teachers already know, and yet we must remind ourselves again and again of this reality. It is impossible to appreciate something complex without massive exposure. It wasn't really until I began digging through Bach's complete keyboard music that I felt like I actually liked Bach. Up until that point, I just hadn't had enough exposure. One prelude and fugue here and another there isn't enough to create understanding and appreciation, especially for such a complex and multifaceted composer. That's my fourth point. If you want to truly appreciate something complex, you have to maximize your exposure. For us as teachers, this means that we don't just teach our students how to play their instruments or how to sing, but we also demonstrate to them how to be lifelong learners and lifelong listeners as we slowly make our way through the works of our great composers. It would not be right to talk about Bach for so long and yet to neglect his religious faith. Some have argued that Bach, being a child of the 17th and 18th centuries, of course had to comply with the religious dogmas of his time on pain of persecution. Some have even suggested that a man of his intelligence could not possibly have been a genuine believer in the doctrines of Lutheran Christianity. Yet, the belongings he left after his death tell a different story. Leaving to one side the religious content of his vocal music, we also have his personal library. He owned over 100 theological volumes, quite an unusually high number for a musician of the time. In addition to several works by Martin Luther and a sort of Lutheran study Bible from the 18th century, he also purchased, in midlife, a deluxe set of the complete works of Martin Luther at the cost of about half a month's salary. He took the works of the Reformer very seriously. Indeed, in his study Bible, Bach actually wrote annotations in the margins, especially on passages dealing with music, and we have that study Bible. While it may be overstated to refer to Bach as the fifth evangelist, he certainly was a man who interacted with Christian faith at a much more thorough level than merely composing for the sake of his employment. Yet, it saddens me to say that the city council in Leipzig, which hired him to write church music, gave him a lot of trouble and made life very difficult for him. Even from the beginning of his time in Leipzig, there was a debate within the city council about what type of position it was that Bach was being appointed to. One party considered the cantor position at the Thomas School to be a mixture of music direction and teaching, and they would not allow Bach to delegate his responsibilities of teaching to another individual. He was also supposed to teach non-musical classes. He was supposed to teach Latin. Another party on the council considered the position more like a Kapellmeister position, which was supposed to be exclusively concerned with music direction and composition and not with teaching. Bach himself was under the impression when he took the position that it would be the second type. Yet the council frequently fought with him and pressured him to perform non-musical teaching responsibilities, even though Bach had chosen and paid from his own expense somebody else to handle these aspects of his job. On another occasion, Bach was led to write an appeal to the city council of Leipzig for greater resources to carry out his objective of providing concerted music for the Lutheran services. He argued that they were not providing the musical forces that they had promised he would have, and he felt that he could not do what he needed to do with what they were providing. This ongoing struggle may have even led to the gradual decline in Bach's cantata output during his years in Leipzig, as he realized that he would not be supported with the musical forces that he needed. Yet, he carried on to the end of his days with the strong conviction that his calling in life was to make music, to the glory of God and for the instruction and delight of his neighbor. Thus we have my final observation. Good music is worth fighting for. We have two documents from 1730, both written by Bach, which show the state of his career as a music director 7 years into his tenure in Leipzig. One of the documents is a letter written to the city council about the musical forces. From this letter, we discover that he would like to have a chorus of 12 singers, 3 to a part, but apparently he was not able to get this many. We also learn that rather than having a small orchestra, 1 or 2 players per part, he had to utilize only 4 town pipers, 3 professional string players, and a musical apprentice. Of these players, he says the following. This is a quote. "Modesty forbids me to speak at all truthfully of their qualities and musical knowledge. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that they are partly emeritus and partly not at all in such exercise as they should be." So they weren't very good. Unfortunately, it does not seem that the town council responded positively to his request. The second document from 1730 is a letter written to his friend, who is now a foreign diplomat, a man named Georg Erdmann. Erdmann had been a friend of Bach's from his schoolboy days, and Erdmann was now a legal advisor at the Russian court in Gdansk. I will read this letter in full because it gives us a window into Bach's mindset and the problems he faced. This is a quote. "Most honored sir, your honor will be good enough to excuse an old and faithful servant for taking the liberty of troubling you with this. It must be nearly 4 years now since your honor favored me with a kind reply to the letter I sent you. Since you then, as I recall, graciously requested news of what had befallen me, I shall obediently furnish this herewith. You are well acquainted with my fata from my youth, the things that have happened to him, and the mutation that took me to Curtin as Kapellmeister, where I had a gracious prince who both loved and understood music, and with whom I had expected to end my days. But it had to happen that the said Serenissimus married a Bernburg princess, as a result of which it seemed that his musical inclination weakened somewhat, especially as the princess seemed to be an A-musa. So God ordered it that I should be called here as director of music and cantor at the Thomas School. Now, it seemed to me at first not at all the right thing to become a cantor after being a Kapellmeister, and I postponed my resolution for 3 months. But this station was described to me as so favorable that finally, especially as my sons seemed to be inclined towards study, I risked myself in the name of the Most High and came to Leipzig, took my examination, and accepted the change. And here, following God's will, I have remained until now. But since now, number 1, I find that this post is not as remunerative as it was described to me. Number 2, many of the accidentia of the station have been withdrawn. That's like other ways of earning income. Number 3, the cost of living is very high here. And number 4, the authorities are odd and little interested in music, with the result that I must live with almost constant vexation, envy, and harassment. I shall be compelled, with the help from the Most High, to seek my fortune elsewhere. If your honor should know of or could find a convenable station in your city for an old and faithful servant, may I humbly request you to put in a gracious recommendation for me." Now I must tell you a little about my domestic situation. I have married a second time. This is still a quote. My late first wife having died at Curtin. From my first marriage, 3 sons and a daughter are still living, whom your honor will graciously remember meeting in Weimar. From my second marriage, 1 son and 2 daughters are still living. My eldest son is a law student, the other 2 are still at school, the one in the first and the other in the second class. And my eldest daughter is as yet unmarried. children of my second marriage are still young. The eldest is a boy, age 6. But they are all born musicians, and I can assure you that I can form a vocal and instrumental ensemble from my family, especially as my present wife sings a very pleasing soprano, and my eldest daughter can also join in not too badly. I should almost overstep the bounds of courtesy were I to incommode your honor further, and therefore hasten to close with my most devoted and lifelong respect, remaining your honor's most obedient and devoted servant, Johann Sebastian Bach. So this is in 1730. He doesn't get a letter back from Erdmann. He does not move from Leipzig. This was at the end of the huge spurt of creative activity where he composed 1 cantata per week for 5 years. He would end up spending the rest of his days in Leipzig, either because he was unable to find anything better, or he made his peace with the arrangements that he could find in the city that he was in. The life of the artist is never simple, but I think from the beginning to the end of Bach's life, his conviction was clear that good music is worth fighting for. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Awesome.
Yes. I'll take questions.
I think you've opened up a flood of ideas, thoughts, emotions, suggestions, knowledge, new knowledge, critiques, whatever, from all of us.
So your first paragraph was listing the significant compositions for keyboard. Wait, just a minute.
Non-comprehensive list, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this I find curious, and other people I think have found it curious, that the symphonias are often omitted in any list. And I noted that the list didn't include the preludes. And
Preludes outside of the Waltzenberg Clavier?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yes.
15 little preludes.
Yes.
And it's like those two areas have been, in my life, those symphonias have been various, and I think, are they less worthy of the body of
Not at all.
Bach's?
No.
Why?
Very worthy.
And the preludes, gosh, if you look on the CM level 7, level 6, how they delineate which of the preludes are good for level 7, which of the preludes are good for level 6, and God forbid that you should make a mistake and do one of the preludes from level 6 for a level 7 student. And I just, I look at those two preludes. I did the D minor and the E minor this year, and with this student, and was horrified after we had gotten well done in the D minor to have to pull it and do the E minor, and I said, why? And I just go, sometimes.
I agree, and the truth is that the Well-Tempered Clavier, especially the second book, is a compilation, like the Mass in B minor, where he's basically grabbing his favorite pieces that he's written over the past 30 years and pairing them, preludes and fugues, together and revising them. So he didn't sit down and write all of those pieces at once. And before he put that collection together, for all intents and purposes, all of those preludes would have just been in a big collection, undifferentiated from each other. So the Well-Tempered Clavier, it's not like he was trying to say all of the other pieces are not worthwhile, just that this is one collection of them.
I just love getting into the preludes, even this late in life, the 15 little preludes. I just love it. And there's so much wealth there.
I agree.
The symphonies too.
You mentioned some part of Bach music. When you listen, you feel painful. So what kind of imagination or what kind of experience you can link with Bach music? Because usually when we listen just Bach music is kind of what is on the heaven is like painful, and then moment is feeling the painful all the same or different times, like we read the Bible different time with the same
Same words.
yeah, same words, but we have
A different response
feeling.
to it.
Yeah. So
That's a good question. Yeah, I mentioned painful specifically with the last G minor variation from the Goldberg variations. You know, the whole piece is in G major except for the 3 variations that are in G minor. And it's almost painful even to think of it right now, because it's so, if I try to describe what it is about it, that makes it so hard to listen to. I think it's, the harmonic language is incredibly shocking, especially for Bach's time, you know, moving from G minor down to F minor, down to E flat minor. It's disturbing, I think. But it's a disturbing sense. It is, it's not painful in the sense that I don't want to listen to it. I do want to listen to it,
So
and I
emotional.
want to
Yeah.
feel that pain.
That you can feel that in the Chaconne too, because he wrote that as a response to his wife's death. And so when I hear like a young child play the Chaconne, I'm just like, oh, no. You know,
There's a weight behind it.
there's a huge weight. And I have a book that was written by Arnold Steinhardt, and I can't remember the name of it right now. It's called Violin Dreams. And it's a fiction book, but it's kind of all about the Chaconne, and it kind of takes you through the history of Bach's writing of it and the violin that it might have been played on. It's just really great, and a friend of mine gave me the book, and after I read the book, I went downstairs and I played the Chaconne. And it you know, it had that like power, you know.
Yeah,
It drew you in.
yeah, that's such a powerful piece.
So I won't actually let my students play it unless they read the book first.
Oh.
So it was like a commitment.
Is that the Chaconne that Brahms has transcribed?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, there is a Brahms version of it.
Oh, there
piano
is?
left
Okay.
hand.
Oh,
Yeah.
that is,
The most famous version of it is, of course, the Busoni version, but the Busoni version is very souped up. Bach has a version where it's hardly even a transcription. He basically just copied it into bass clef for the left hand
Okay.
to play on the piano.
just, if you wanna hear a very moving, painfully beautiful, movement, go on YouTube, listen to Elizabeth Blumenstock playing the Chaconne.
Hmm.
It's amazing.
Yeah, Shirley.
Yes, we understand Bach's music is so essential. So how would you inspire your young student to understand Bach's music? Like, you know, usually we play the left hand for company, but it's not in Bach's case, right? So they have to listen 2 melodies or sometimes even 3 or 4 melodies at the same time. So the young students will feel very tired or even, you know, they don't have patience to do that. So how would you inspire them to approach his music?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're absolutely right that the complexity of it, especially in the left hand, is beyond what other pieces usually have, especially at that level. Yeah, I think that, as I said, exposure is such a great thing because it's not just that, you know, especially a young student, they can't play a large number of pieces because they're young,
for
right?
them
But
they feel like such a big work and then
Yeah,
they want to work
it's-
on that.
yes, it's so much work, but exposure in the sense of sharing a little bit about Bach, sharing where he's from, sharing who these pieces are for, that these are pieces written for his wife and for his children, or that he compiled them so that his wife and children could play them. And, you know, playing through several of the pieces from the notebooks so that students kind of hear similarities between, you know, the different G major preludes or G minor minuet, or, you know, just so they get a sense of what the different things are in that collection, so that they have some context for it and not just, this is a very frustrating piece that I can't play right now. But it is difficult.
So you understand Bach's music by harmonic change? Because it is like absent music instead of program music. So you hurry to tell the stories of the music itself. So
Yeah, the titles, I
yeah.
get asked all the time by students, why is every piece called minuet?
They made money doing jobs,
dancing.
playing
They
gigs.
like to
They
dance.
had to-
So yeah, there's kind of in some ways, a lack of creativity in the naming of pieces in the 18th century, but that doesn't mean that we can't try to help them understand more of the context around the piece, even though we might not have a fun title that we can attach to it. And you can always ask, what does this piece make you think of? You know, even though there's not one answer to that question, music always causes our imagination to run, especially for kids.
One last question, please. Two influential keyboard keyboardists. Which one has the most powerful influence in your life? Glenn Gould, Wanda Landowska.
Definitely Glenn Gould for me. I think the two pianists that I listen to the most for Bach are Gould and Andras Schiff.
Oh, my heart skips a beat.
And I do feel safer imitating Andras Schiff than I do imitating Glenn Gould.
You don't sing along.
But I still really enjoy Gould's playing.
So no conflict in your mind with which one had the more powerful influence on keyboard historically with Wanda Landowska versus, we're not going there, we don't want to go to that place.
Of course.
The question was personal.
Yeah, I don't have a strong thought about it. I'm curious what your impression is.
Well, I just thought that she did so much for the harpsichord, so
Absolutely.
much for the resurrection of authentic sound, you know, in keyboard music, that I'm not saying that I'm beholden, exclusive, but I just have to honor, you know,
Yeah,
her contribution.
yeah. In terms of greater awareness of the sort of historical instruments,
Yeah.
historical ways of playing Bach. Yeah, for sure.
And you love the pedal. You did a
I
good
do.
job. You did a good job.
Yeah, I like the pedal. Andras Schiff doesn't use pedal on Bach,
Oh.
but I do. And
And you're okay with that?
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Well, as going to SC, okay, and as an organ major in the late 60s, there was this entire movement that you shouldn't do anything that Bach could not have done on his own instruments. Then when I later put some students in the Bach Festival, I decided the judging was entirely different. It was on flow, and they added the crescendos and the diminuendos that would not have been available at that time. Where is it now?
Yeah. I would be inclined, I'd be curious to hear other impressions about this. My own impression is that, and again, I'm not an organist, so I don't have knowledge specifically of that world in the way that you do. But my impression is still that people are okay with doing things that could not literally have been done by Bach. I'm a pianist, after all. I'm not a harpsichordist. I do like the harpsichord, but I don't think that it's wrong to play Bach on the piano.
I just want to underscore what was going on with the, how many of you remember the meeting we had at my home? And Betty had arranged for our Baroque specialist, what was his name again? Who came to our home in January 2 years ago.
I know,
But
I don't remember his name.
his
but
basic
one of-
intent was that Bach can be played in a variety of ways and it's still legitimate and he,
Yes.
so I just kind of let that be kind of a credo on that, so.
Yeah. And, you know, I was trying to get at this from a slightly different angle as well in the talk by talking about just how open Bach was to different styles. And that he tried to integrate Italian styles of composition and performance, and he tried to integrate French styles of ornamentation and performance and composition, and he liked to use instruments in unusual ways. He liked to put weird pairings, like in the cantatas. There's, you know, you'll have singers and then 3 oboes, or, you know, and I think he liked, you know, he kind of had this imagination for doing things in ways that might seem unexpected but still have musical integrity. So I think that he always valued musical integrity, but was able to see that play out in a lot of different ways, and not just in one narrow way.
So you have to think that if it were available, he would have used the pedal and crescendo, all of that.
He would have figured out some way to make use of it, and we don't know exactly what he would have done with it. But you know, I think that he thought of, you know, I think just the way he thought of composition, he had no inhibitions about taking a piece of music by somebody else and just changing it for a performance. Because, you know, a composer was working with tones and rhythms, and he as a musician, he's working with the same material, and so he wasn't afraid to change it in order to suit what he thought would be good for that situation. So I don't know what he would have done with the pedal or other instruments, but he would have done something with it, I would have to imagine.
And I don't think they had copyright laws.
Correct, yes, that's a whole other thing. A whole other debate. But yes, no copyright, though, I mean, I think it still would have been frowned upon if you had showed up for the Sunday service with a cantata that you said was yours and they found out that it was actually not by you. I think that would have been frowned upon, but all of the gray area in between of taking things and reworking them, yeah, the legality of that was not very strictly enforced.
Andrew, your work today is just magnificent.
Thank you.
We're so thrilled
Thank you.
to have you with us. Thank you.
I must say, I think you are kinder and humbler than Bach himself in saying all music is music. I think you are opening your arms in a big, broad way. I know what you intend to say, but I mean, there is different quality of every style and every era.
You don't.
Anyway,
Absolutely,
You don't.
I agree,
thank you.
I agree, yes.
Wonderful